Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of The Hated and the Dead. Very excited to have this online for all of you today. Thank you to everyone who listened to the introduction I recorded last week. Just one thing before we get started today. I'm going to make a Twitter account for this podcast. For those of you who use Twitter regularly, I think this will be the best way for you to keep in touch with the show and to see when new episodes are coming out. On that topic, I'm hoping that I can release an episode every Sunday, all things being equal. I will share the new Twitter account on my own Twitter account, which is @TLehman3. I'm yet to find out who T Lehman 1 and T Lehman 2 are, but I will keep you posted. Today's episode, then. The subject of today's conversation is a man who has controversy follow him around like a Jack Russell. It is, of course, Silvio Berlusconi. Berlusconi was the Prime Minister of Italy 3 times between 1994 and 2011. He's one of the most successful politicians in Italian history. Prior to politics, he was also the owner of multiple television networks, and he was also the owner of AC Milan for 3 decades, guiding the football club through some of its greatest success. Why should you be interested in him? Well, because in many ways, he's a back-to-the-future politician who was ahead of his time. In many ways, the first modern politician, with his brash populism predating the similar tactics of Donald Trump by nearly 30 years. Joining me today to discuss this most pivotal of characters is Professor John Foote of the University of Bristol. John has written numerous books about Italian politics and football, including Milan Since the Miracle, Calcio, and The Archipelago, which I read a couple of weeks ago and would highly recommend. I really enjoyed our conversation. John is very thorough in his analysis and melds together a lot of themes and tropes of Italian politics very effectively. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Silvio Berlusconi. John, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk with me today. We're talking about Silvio Berlusconi today. If we just jump straight in then. So Berlusconi was born in 1936 in Milan. He's still alive, of course, currently serving as a member of the European Parliament, as I found out when I was reading about him this week at the age of 85. You make a point in the book of saying that Berlusconi's early life, much like the rest of it, is kind of hotly contested and shrouded in mystery. What do we know for sure about his family and his early business career? And a particularly pertinent question, given his business career that he'd later on have, is, was he born wealthy?
He wasn't born wealthy. He wasn't born particularly poor. He's born in a kind of working class neighbourhood of Milan called Isola, Island, which is now quite gentrified. But if you go and look at the apartment block he was born into, these are not sort of desperately poor. It's a normal upbringing. His father was some sort of banker. I think the important things about his childhood are he had a very strong connection with his mother, and you could go into all kinds of psychology about that. But I think he had a normal upbringing and comfortable. He lived through the war, of course, which he never talks about. But I think the Milan sort of links and roots are very important, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. His kind of being from Milan is always important to him throughout his business and political career. His intimate connection with the city is very important, and he often refers back to that at various points in his biography. I think the murky parts and the bits that are contested start to kick in when he starts to become a business entrepreneur quite early on in his 20s and 30s. And then we have a whole set of different versions. And in kind of everything in Berlusconi's life and career has about 3 versions. That is part of being a public figure, but it's also part of his kind of reinvention of himself at various times.
So what was his first big success in business?
Well, again, this is you're right into the contested part, right? How did he get his first big break? I mean, he did various things, some of which is shrouded in myth, and I don't think is particularly important, like singing on cruise ships and all this kind of stuff, and all that is part. You're already in the myth, okay? It's very hard to separate myth and reality with Berlusconi because of his reinvention of himself and how much has been written about him. Thousands of books have been written about him, millions of articles, not millions, but hundreds of thousands of articles. He starts to become interested in sort of the building trade in the 60s in Milan. And Milan is a boom city. It's expanding rapidly, and there's a lot of money to be made in building houses in particular, and he starts to become involved in that in the 60s, and one of the sort of mythical contested parts is how he got his first sort of investment into what he was doing. Where did that money come from? And the detractors of Berlusconi say that money's a bit dodgy. Where did that come from? Did it come from the mafia? Other people would say he worked hard, he got his own investment, he did his own thing. That's his part of his myth as well. So you're already in a kind of divided version. Sure. But certainly he was a very, very successful entrepreneur in buying land and building. And I think you need to realise what he did was very innovative already. All the way through, he's an innovator. He's always ahead of the game in terms of Italian capitalism and the changing nature of the city. And I think that's a very important thing to realise about him. And I'll say straight away, we need to take Berlusconi seriously. One of the things that really annoys me in the way that people have asked me about Milan over the years is they treat him as a joke, someone to laugh at. He isn't. I mean, he is. There are those aspects, but he's someone to be taken very, very seriously indeed. He's a serious businessman and he's a serious political operator.
For sure. I think through your book, The Archipelago, you do paint a picture of a man who likes to be treated as a bit of fun, but is very mischievous. He's a very dark figure in lots of ways, and his political figure and his political career, in many ways, is extremely unpleasant. If we look at his political career, then the starting point for understanding Berlusconi, the politician, is the 1980s. And to set the scene a bit, can you describe for people listening what the wider socioeconomic and political situation in Italy was like during the 80s? I think in the book you paint a picture of a political system that's become quite ossified.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good word to use. I mean, by the 80s, Italy was still a system with enormous parties, mass parties, the Communist Party, the Christian Democrats. In Milan, in particular, the Socialist Party was a very important power broker. And those parties ran everything. I mean, they ran the handing out of contracts. There was a huge state sector, which they had all their fingers in every single pie. The system was extremely corrupt, but it did involve lots of people. So people were kind of co-opted into this system where the parties, people call it a partytocracy, some of the political scientists. And so that was the kind of system, but it was a system that kind of looked very stable, but in fact underneath there wasn't that much there. These mass parties had been mass parties with huge memberships, but those memberships were fading away by the 80s. And what you have is the top of the parties still running things, but underneath that kind of mobilization wasn't really there anymore. And Berlusconi becomes a political player on the back of his entrepreneurial success as a builder, and in particular by the 1980s as a burgeoning TV entrepreneur. So he is the first person really, and it's one of the first people to really understand that the TV sector is out of date. It needs massive innovation and renewal. And he starts up some private TV stations, which are much more interesting and fun than the state TV stations. So he becomes influential in the 70s, and he starts to have political connections, which you need to do anything in Milan and Italy at that time. Particularly, his very strong political connection was a man called Bettino Craxi, who is prime minister head of the Socialist Party, very powerful operator, and Berlusconi forms a very strong alliance with Bettino Craxi. He's not in politics, but he's kind of within the system, and he gives Craxi stuff. Craxi gives him stuff like power and influence, and that connection will continue for a bit into the 1990s. So the 80s are a time when it looks great. Everybody's making money. It's Milan in particular is looking like a fantastic place to make money. The stock exchange is booming, but underneath, the actual foundations of that economy are pretty fragile.
Absolutely, and I mean a very important element of Berlusconi's influence in this era as well, and into the 1990s was obviously football. Can you talk a little bit about his sort of melding football with television? I think that's quite an interesting element of him.
So this is crucial to understanding Berlusconi. And one of the things that kind of annoys me about the way people talk about Berlusconi, especially in Italy, strangely, is that they ignore the football. And there are actually entire books about Berlusconi that don't talk about football, which I find extraordinary. So he again, this is another example of his use of innovation, being ahead of his time. Milan Football Club, which is one of the great football clubs of the world, one of the two great Milan-based football teams. And I'd say also Milan I'm biased, but I think it's one of the great footballing cities. If you look at its population, about 1 million, and how many trophies and the two great clubs that play there, it's punching above its weight massively. Absolutely. In footballing terms. Milan had gone through a bad time. It had gone kind of bankrupt. It had been relegated twice, and it wasn't in a good place. He saw an opportunity there. He bought it for not very much money, and immediately began to transform the club into something that was much more modern. And it's really the first modern club in terms of advertising, in terms of the use of private television to promote his club, in terms of the football they played. It's crucial to understand that he said, you've got to play attacking football. You have to try and win every game. And that wasn't the Italian mentality at the time. He discovered a completely unknown manager called Arrigo Sacchi, who managed just Parma in Serie B, which is the second division of Italy. Brought him to Milan, which was, everyone thought, this is crazy. And this guy transformed not just Italian football, he transformed world football. This is an innovator who is still being copied today by people like Guardiola and others, sure. His kind of guru, because he played attacking football, pressing game. So, he used football he wanted to be a winner, but also it also affected all the other sectors of his empire, which was building TV, advertising, and eventually politics. I mean, so he identified himself with the football team very, very strongly.
Sure. But even with his football, he kind of has a tendency to engulf everything. I think there's a quote in your book where you say something like, Berlusconi wants to be the manager, the player, the coach. The problem is he might want to be the referee as well. And I think that's a really interesting way of putting it, and something which obviously becomes it's quite a prophetic remark for what goes on later, really, in his political career.
He's very interventionist in terms of the team. He'll go down to the dressing room and sort of give them a team talk. He'll continually, impose or try to impose tactics. And being manager of Milan, you have to be quite thick-skinned. I mean, Ancelotti has spoken about this, about managing Berlusconi and, managing his public pronouncements. And you basically couldn't play defensive football if you were manager of Milan, because that was unacceptable to the way Berlusconi saw football as a entertainment industry. He saw it as, and again, miles ahead of his time, really. People talk about the Premier League and stuff like that, but Berlusconi is really doing stuff that is now seen as, normal, but not at that time. And yes, his identification with everything around himself is very important, because this is, again, something new, or relatively new, which he will then take into the political sphere in a really completely almost revolutionary way in the 1990s. So, the party with a leader, yes, that was true of the socialists. It wasn't true of the Christian Democrats, particularly. They were kind of amorphous mass. He will make a party that's entirely based around himself. And that is something that will then become normal in the world, but it wasn't in 1994.
Yeah. If we talk about the 90s, then the breaking point for this quite unresponsive political system comes in the early 90s with the Tangentopoli scandal, this far-reaching bribery scandal. I think Tangentopoli means Bribesville. It's kind of hard to overstate the extent of the corruption uncovered during the investigations that followed. But in brief, what happens to Italian politics as a result of this scandal?
So everything that's been going on that people know about is suddenly revealed by a judicial investigation which begins in Milan in 1992 and uncovers like this kind of huge system of corruption, scientific, where the parties are all paid off every time there's a public contract, every time businesses are kind of constrained to pay a certain percentage to the parties, and the parties survive thanks to this system of corruption and kickbacks. And this is exposed by the judges, and it's a very extraordinary moment. I was actually living in Milan when this broke, and I would walk past the law courts almost every day because the library I work in, and you'd see press out there, people being arrested every day. This goes right to the top. You know, it's not just, it starts quite local, but it goes right to the top of the system. And thousands of politicians are arrested. Hundreds are put on trial. This is all live on TV. It's an amazing moment. And incredibly quickly, the party system collapses because it's built on sand, and people won't take it anymore. And there are demonstrations against the thieves who are running Italy. And out of those ashes, lots of things emerge. It's a time when everything's up for grabs. There are populists emerging, such as the Northern Leagues, an amazing man called Umberto Bossi, who basically shouts all the time and is saying, down with the thieves, and takes kind of nooses into Parliament to hang the people who are arrested. On these kind of ashes, there's no one knows what's going to happen, really. But it looks like the left is going to win for the first time. The left has never won an election in post-war Italy. 1994, election is held. And that's the moment when Silvio Berlusconi, it's a very dramatic moment, extraordinary moment. I talk about it a lot in my books. The so-called taking the field.
Yes.
And
football term.
He combines football language, political language. He's having great success with Milan by that time. They're winning championships and European trophies. And he takes the political field, and it's an amazing moment, I think, in global politics.
Well, as often appears to be the case, he kind of presents himself as the man to save the country, the only person that can save the system. He becomes prime minister in '94, as you say, after winning this election. You said it was a very big moment. I think you write in the book that he was the first populist leader elected in Western Europe since the war. Is that right?
Yeah, I think he is the forerunner of a whole series of populists who, going up to Trump and in lots of countries now, there are populist movements. Some have taken power, some haven't. He's the forerunner in terms of a whole series of things: style, the personalization of politics around himself. He doesn't need a party. He doesn't have a party. He has something called clubs, which you can form yourself. He has a business behind him, which I think is important. Remember, Trump again, so many connections with Berlusconi. Trump again was someone with a business, also with building. There's a whole series of parallels there. And very simple slogans, very fun almost, very charismatic, very TV orientated, and completely different to the mass parties that had gone before and the way they did things. So no one expected him to stand. No one expected him to win. He came from nowhere, and no one really could deal with the differences in style and government and the way he would just say stuff that was completely off the rails, and then 2 days later say, "Oh, sorry, I made a mistake. I didn't really mean to say that," which is another classic populist trait, I think. So he he forms this party which is not a party, called Forza Italia. He wins an election from nowhere. He wins it in lots of working class seats, in fact, which is very interesting. And again, there's lots of parallels there with Trump, with Johnson, with other people in the political systems of the world at the moment. But he doesn't really know how to govern.
No.
He doesn't have the alliances in place. And the first experience is something of a disaster. And it also, we see the first moments of a clash with the judiciary, which will go on for the next, what are we now, 27 years? Still going on. This clash with the judicial authorities and the continual trials that he's involved with over the next 20, 25 years.
I absolutely want to come on to the corruption aspect of him, but before we do you think he would have become Prime Minister without Tangentopoli? Because I was thinking about this when I was reading your book, and although obviously this scandal was a great inflection point for the entire system, it almost seems that his own appeal was based on, as you said, his presence on television, his image, and those things had already been built up by the time Tangentopoli took place. So do you think if that scandal hadn't been uncovered in a sort of counterfactual scenario, Berlusconi would have risen to power anyway?
I don't think so, because I think he worked very well behind the scenes. He was quite happy with his businesses that are making lots of money. I think he felt constrained to some extent to take the field, because one of his kind of more old-fashioned traits of his ideology, and you could talk about a Berlusconian ideology, is anti-communism, anti-left, and he thought that if the left took power, they would kind of strip him of his businesses, come for him in some way, pass an antitrust law, because Italy had a very strange media system where he had an enormous monopoly over private television, which was never dealt with by any of the governments. In fact, it was enabled by Craxi, his friend, before that. So he was worried. And one of the reasons he goes into politics is to kind of protect his businesses and protect his person. And, that then you get a whole series of what are called personal laws, which are passed in the 90s and 2000s, which are all about designing laws which will somehow allow him to continue as he had done before without the worry about being prosecuted or brought to trial in some way. So I think he would have worked behind the scenes. You never know. But I think that gap, that emptiness left by Tangentopoli, someone had to fill it. Yeah. It could have been the left. When he saw the left were going to win, that's when he went in.
He serves as Prime Minister 3 times, once in 94 for a very brief period, and then twice over the course of the 2000s. But when I was reading about him, it seemed that what he actually did when he was in power isn't really important to understanding what sort of a politician he is, because he didn't seem to do very much in sort of political terms anyway. I think he was very good at getting into power, but he didn't really have any vision for how to govern or how to take the country forward. It was all about what he could extract from the system. I mean, do you think he has an ideologically coherent view of politics? I mean, you mentioned the anti-communism, but do you think it goes very much beyond that?
Not really. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the so-called Berlusconi era, which I put down as sort of 20 years from 94 until he's finally brought down in 2011. I mean, that's the last time. He's still around in politics after that, but he's still around today. But he's no longer a big player after that. I think he doesn't want to particularly reform the state. He doesn't really particularly want to. He doesn't have a kind of grand vision of change. And, all the time he spent in power, you look at the reforms and you think that's actually quite disappointing. It's difficult for anyone to reform Italian politics, so that's not particularly surprising. But with all the kind of talk of he's a free marketeer, he isn't really a free marketeer. He's not a Thatcher. in any sense. And I don't think he would claim to be. And there's quite a big gap between rhetoric and reality. And a lot of it is about managing the system, continuities in terms of what's actually going on. Some privatizations, but actually the left did quite a lot of privatizations as well.
Yeah.
And winning elections and keeping power for power's sake as well. So he's very good at winning elections. He's very good at using power for his own personal ends. He's not particularly interested in transforming Italy, despite the talk of a new Italian miracle and all this kind of advertising slogan. So he's a kind of model for campaigning. And it's a continuous campaign. Again, that's a populist trope that you can see in Trump and others, is the campaign never ends and the creation of enemies never ends. Very good at creating enemies, fake enemies to fight against. Communism is the key one, but there are many others. Migrants and other such enemies. Europe becomes another one at certain points. He doesn't like being unpopular, so when he goes into Iraq, for example, he doesn't really want to be there, and he wants to get out as soon as possible because it's not popular. So that's the kind of Berlusconi era. At the time, however, I think the thing to underline is I think he did a lot of damage to the political system because he was always undermining the rule of law, always talking about conspiracies amongst the judges, and I think that kind of discourse seeped into the political system, and that was very damaging.
Well, let's talk about the corruption under Berlusconi then. I mean, Berlusconi's ticket to power was this corruption scandal in the 90s. But there's a huge irony there because he was dogged by accusations of corruption really through his entire political career. I was trying to think what could account for this paradox. Do you think that after it was found that so many politicians had been dishonest about their corrupt activities during Tangentopoli, that quite a lot of Italians warmed to Berlusconi, not in spite of his corruption, but almost because he was more transparent than the others and kind of blasé about playing the system?
I think to some extent, also the Tangentopoli did scare a lot of people. You have to remember a lot of people were in that system. And yeah, they were happy many people were happy for the kind of head of that system be chopped off. You know, the politicians, once it started getting down into the business system, people say, well, okay, stop now.
Yeah.
And the conspiracy, theories did also gain some traction. You know, this is the left-wing judges, red judges, chopping off the head so they can take power. That's the kind of thing that was being pushed very early on. Berlusconi, let's remember before we start even talking about this, that he's only been found definitively guilty in one case, and it's just tax fraud.
Yeah.
So he has been on trial numerous times. I've lost count for many, many different things. Some of which are straightforward corruption. Some of which is more to do with favoritism, tax fraud. There's dozens of different things. Sex-related scandals. Not being found definitively guilty. In Italy, there are 3 tiers of justice. So you have to be very careful when you're talking about this, that he, not just careful for lawyers, but just also careful politically as well, that the system, he's often on trial, but he's very rarely found guilty. And that's why he's been able to maintain a position in politics for so long. He also has very expensive lawyers and has spent a lot of money, as he often complains, on lawyers spending, so he is someone who can work the system, particularly the statute of limitations, in terms of trials running out of time. There's a very important trial about corruption of judges in Rome in the 80s, and you have to remember he took over the enormous Mondadori publishing system. So he didn't just own TV stations, he owns national newspapers and so on, magazines, the whole massive publishing system. He was able to run that trial down so that he was guilty and not guilty at the same time. He was guilty, but the time had run out, and that was often the case. So to get back to your question, I think a lot of people, the message that Berlusconi said was, okay, we've got rid of some of the politicians. I don't like politicians. He doesn't want to be a politician. He's always anti-political, which is another populist trait. I'm not a politician. I'm an ordinary guy who's very successful. I'm a good-looking guy. I've got loads of young women running after me. There's all that as well. I look at my football team. I can win. I can build houses. But I'm not going to come for you. You can do what you want. I'm not going to come for you if you haven't paid all your taxes. Carry on. And that's quite a powerful message, in Italy. It's not, he's not like a police chief saying, I'm coming for all of you. You've got to pay all your taxes. No way. We've stopped with that. We're now going to carry on more or less as before. And that people like that. People like that message.
This definitely isn't.
Tangentopoli was over. And increasingly he indulged in conspiracy theories about Tangentopoli, which had brought into power, indulged in conspiracy theories about the red conspiracies.
I was reading something about Mexico recently, and somebody was trying to explain why Mexican society is so corrupt at all levels, and this author said corruption's the most democratic thing about Mexico, because if you have a very closed off political system, often if you're not well connected, the only way that you can really get anything done for your kids or for yourself or for your family is to be corrupt. So there's a kind of, I guess, self-perpetuating quality to corruption. Do you think that's something that he plays off?
Yeah, the continuities with the 80s are quite strong, and his own businesses are exposed as part of the system, which is not particularly surprising. He gets away with a lot of things that other people wouldn't get away with because he is powerful and because he has powerful lawyers, but he also reflects back on the way that society was and had individualized society. The working class was dying, the factories were closing, a different kind of society had emerged, which he very much reflected and exalted and celebrated through his TV stations, which are very much about consumerism and selling stuff, and the glorification of wealth and power and charisma. And that kind of reflects that kind of model. I'm successful, you want to be like me. You want to be glamorous and successful like me. That kind of Berlusconi clones some people talked about, and I think that was very powerful as a message. It wasn't everybody, because we have to remember that Berlusconi inspired a massive opposition movement on the streets, millions of people demonstrating against them, people horrified by what was going on. But that movement very rarely came to power. Only once did Berlusconi really definitively lose an election in 1996. All the others he won or lost by nothing. He also indulged in other strategies, which are very much the things that we're familiar with now. He said that when he lost the election, that it was all about voter fraud, and he actually kind of refused to kind of leave office after one election that was, in fact, incredibly close. All those kind of strategies, I'm sure that people like Trump learned from, undermining the system. I think it was, as I said, very problematic for the legitimation of the Italian system. One other thing to remember, the Italian judicial system is very powerful. It's to some extent independent, and much more than, for example, a British system. And politicians do get arrested in Italy, and they do get tried. I often think the British kind of superiority complex about our politicians aren't corrupt, we don't do this kind of thing, that's all an Italian thing, is unfair, is a stereotype. But it's also based around a judicial system in Britain which never investigates politicians. It's all about the police. They have a proper judiciary, magistrates who investigate, like France, and therefore you can get that. You don't get that in Britain.
Yeah,
so it's not. There's no point being we're not corrupt, you're a corrupt society. I think COVID has really exposed that as a stereotype.
Well, if you never investigate any corruption, then you'll never find any.
Exactly. Yeah. And actually, under the Italian constitution, if a crime is reported to a magistrate, they have to investigate it, which is an amazing sort of thing to have, because it means that you can't say I'm not going to investigate that person because they're too powerful. Of course, you could drop it because they're too powerful, but you have to actually investigate it. It's part of the legal system, and that's a very powerful clause. So Berlusconi has been investigated, well, no one knows how many times, hundreds of times over the last 20 years, and he's still on trial at the age of 85. The so-called Ruby trials are still dragging on and on.
Well, I want to come on to that.
Yeah, no one's interested in them anymore, but they are still going on.
I mean, he, in spite of all of this, he becomes Prime Minister for a second time in 2001 and then for a third time in 2008. But this third time in power is his final stint as Prime Minister. What goes wrong for him between 2008 and 2011? From a sort of corruption point of view and from the wider global financial crisis?
I mean, he's caught up in the economic meltdown of the euro and the global financial crisis. He has no answers for that, as do many other countries. And, his kind of... he is also disowned by Merkel in particular. I mean, you can look at even the body language of Merkel. Merkel thought Berlusconi was a ridiculous figure. She didn't like dealing with him. And in fact, the 2011 pushing out of Berlusconi is a very interesting moment, because basically the president of Italy kind of sacks Berlusconi, who had been elected with quite a big majority, and puts in a European technocrat, Mario Monti, who comes straight out of the EU. And it's an interesting moment because lots of left-wing people were, like myself, were delighted that Berlusconi wasn't prime minister, but democratically there's something slightly strange going on there. So he's brought down really by, the debt crisis, which Italy is in a very serious position around, and the bonds, the yields and so on. He's also brought down by personal scandal. I mean, the scandals become more personal and sexual as time goes on. There are always tax ones, there's always financial things going on, but the scandal around, in particular, his attempts to influence police around one of his sexual partners, who's called Ruby, that was her nickname. That hits the press, it hits the international press. It brings kind of embarrassment.
I mean, this is kind of remarkable. When I was reading your book, didn't he pretend that this girl, and I say girl because she was underage, he pretended that she was the granddaughter of President Mubarak of Egypt? Is that right?
Yes. And the police believed him, or seemed to believe him, and released her from custody. She'd been picked up on a minor charge. He didn't want her to... He obviously saw some sort of problem in her speaking about her connections, and rang up the police station personally, which is an extraordinary thing in any society, and got her released, saying she was Mubarak's niece or granddaughter. But the whole thing was absurd and embarrassing. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't an enormous case, but it's dragged on for a long time. And I think it was the last days of Berlusconi were really kind of like one of those novels you read about a kind of dictator who gone a bit mad.
Well, it does almost sound too ridiculous to be
continual surrounding himself with very, very young women, these parties, this kind of just losing contact with reality. And at the same time, if you imagine the sort of European economic system collapsing, it didn't look that great at that point. And I think, Europe pulled the plug on him, and he was kicked out. And the president of Italy, who is a figurehead a lot of the time, but in moments of crisis becomes very powerful, not directly elected by the people, elected by parliament, but the president kind of chucked him out, and that was it really for his political career. I mean, that was the end of the Berlusconi era, although at the time he protested a lot and still seemed very powerful. It was a long decline began at that point. And one of the things that's interesting is that Berlusconism doesn't really survive Berlusconi. Populism does.
Yes.
And most of the other politicians in Italy, to some extent, have copied Berlusconi's style. Salvini, Renzi, in particular, and they're both in decline now, I would say. But Berlusconism isn't really something that outlives him as a politician. It's, as we said before, the ideology was not really there. It was all around, a lot of it was around his own personal. And then, it'd be interesting to see if the same is true as Trumpism, whatever that is, and whether that survives. And I think there's probably a few more solid roots in certain things like evangelical Christian. Yeah. Berlusconi was never interested in that stuff. I mean, he never played that card. He played the card of being a Catholic sometimes, but it was absurd given his personal life. But he never played any of those cards in a very coherent way. The only card he played coherently was Silvio Berlusconi card, and that, if you haven't got him anymore, doesn't work.
No.
And also Milan started being really rubbish at football as well. So that declined.
As soon as he leaves, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, once he's now sold the club, but he's got Monza now. But they were probably one of the best teams in the world in the 90s. But they're not anymore.
Since he's left the Premiership, as you said, there've been a long series of technocratic governments, often filled by European ministers and commissioners, including the current one, obviously. But they've also been broken up by the rise of these right-wing populist parties. The economy's still moving very slowly. Trust in politicians is extremely low. Speaking 10 years after he left office for the final time, and nearly 30 after he went into office for the first time, what do you think Berlusconi's legacy is?
I think he reflected the decline of a political system and the crisis of the political system. He stepped into that void. And I think Italy's political system is still in deep crisis. And as you say, this continual series of non-political governments interspersed with populist governments. I would say Renzi's government was to some extent populist as well. Renzi very much modelled himself on Berlusconi in terms of his personalised message. And he was very popular for a while. And the rise and fall of these individuals, Italy's political system is struggling very much to find an identity. And he stepped into that void and kind of oversaw that crisis, but had no solutions to it. And the current technocratic government doesn't really, it's always a kind of series of emergency governments again and again, since that's 10 years of them, which is a long time. Or right-wing governments. And then you've got, of course, the Five-Star Movement, which is very much, the prototype of an entirely populist, non-traditional party, which is an extraordinary story in itself and probably couldn't happen without Berlusconi. And Grillo, again, is someone who builds himself on the ashes of Berlusconi, although he very much criticises Berlusconi as well. So I think he didn't leave a legacy in terms of any kind of institutional change or even an ideological shift. I think he reflected all that, reflected changes in society. But he did leave a legacy in terms of a crisis that was left to fester for a very long time and is still festering. And he didn't have any solutions to any of the long-term structural problems of the Italian economy, which, Italy's economic crisis is one of the longest and deepest in Europe. And Italy still really hasn't emerged from it. And it has very deep structural problems, which nobody has a solution to. And Draghi is the latest technocrat to take over that system. Without, is it kind of blood, sweat and tears, kind of Monty politics? We're going to tax you, and which was incredibly unpopular, or is it kind of just management of the system?
It seems like
one interesting thing is just the last thing. I think the Euroscepticism in Italy has really faded, and that was kind of pushed for a bit by Berlusconi, but he never pushed it to the brink. But I think that idea that Italy might leave the EU or leave the euro is off the agenda now. And that's an interesting movement back into the political centre, if you like.
That's really interesting. I mean, it does seem like a political system and a country whose politics is very angry. But to a certain extent, it's hard to tell as an outsider whether that's any worse than most other Western countries. I mean, just as a final question on Berlusconi, I don't think there's anything particularly admirable about him. But do you think that there's anything about his time in power on reflection that you think is at least commendable?
I wouldn't probably use those words, but I think what he is extremely important and interesting. And I think Italy's often seen as a country that follows other countries, a country that's backward, a country that's still, coming into the 21st century. And actually, if you look at the political innovations, Berlusconi really helps you understand everything else that's gone on in the last 20 years. And so I really think he needs to be studied and understood and taken seriously. And I think what I said at the start, commendable, I would think that would be difficult for me to use that word. I think there were lots of aspects which were absolutely dreadful and very damaging to the political fabric. But he was an incredibly competent campaigner and an incredibly successful businessman. And he really understood the zeitgeist, which the old politicians and the left really didn't, and still don't. I mean, the left, the Democratic Party, is still really something that's stuck in a model of 30, 40 years ago. And that, so he's way ahead of his time. And I think that's to be really studied and understood. And it really helps us to understand what happened in the rest of the world. So Italy was ahead of the game in a strange way, as it had been on many other occasions, I think.
John, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I've found this conversation really interesting, and there's certainly the possibility of another conversation about Italian politics more recently there, definitely. Where can people find your work?
So on Berlusconi, I started working on Berlusconi such a long time ago. In my first book on Milan, some stuff on Berlusconi there, which is called Milan Since the Miracle. But there's a lot in the other works, the Archipelago, Italy Since 1945. I think he's the most cited person in the index. So I've kind of been living with him and working on him for such a long time. Those are my most recent and my oldest books. I think if you want to look on football and Berlusconi, there's a lot in my book about Italian football culture and about that deep connection. And I think in those terms, I would say commendable. I think he was a revolutionary in footballing terms. And what he did to Italian football and that team, that Sacchi team, I watched it play live, was the most incredible team I've ever seen and the most beautiful, extraordinary attacking football. And I think that revolution was definitely a global revolution, and it started with that Milan team. So in that sense, in that sphere, he was somebody who completely changed a cultural form, and that then went everywhere else.
Fantastic. John, I will let you get on with the rest of your day, but thank you very much.
Good to talk to you. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released.